Hello, I'm Ronald Engelhardt. Together with my colleague and co-author Pippa Norris, we'd like to express our gratitude to Loyola Marymount University's Global Policy Institute for awarding us the Global Policy Institute's Book of the Year for 2020. It's an honor. We would love to be there to accept it in person, but it's not possible. Since it's not possible, I thought I'd make some comments about the book, what it has to say to help, we hope, explain what's going on now. In particular, I've been teaching at the University of Michigan for 54 years. During the first 50 years, it never crossed my mind that I would someday teach a course entitled, Is Democracy Dying? This year I am. I just started teaching this course this fall, and it's interesting, but we live in troubled times. How did we get here? Well, the book that you have honored proposes some answers. It deals with a cultural clash that has polarized the US and many advanced industrial societies between groups that have fundamentally different values. This cleavage goes back many decades. It began to emerge in the post-war era when something unprecedented happened. Though everyone who had lived through World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, had been exposed to huge insecurities, loss of life, starvation, trauma, and that most of history, most people, most of the time lived a few inches above starvation. Life was insecure for most of history. In the post-war era, something unprecedented happened linked with three developments. One was the economic miracles of the post-war era, tremendous economic growth. Another was these post-war welfare states, which emerged and provided a safety net so that hardly anyone starved any longer in the rich countries of Western Europe, North America, Australia, eventually Japan. But this spread to more and more of the world as time went by. Under these conditions, members, a large share of the post-war generation, grew up taking survival for granted. This was something quite unusual. And this brought massive cultural changes, first in one direction, toward growing emphasis on environmental protection, democracy, gender equality, a whole set of values linked with post-materialist values. I'd like to share the findings here. Our book presents the thesis that the high levels of economic security that emerged in the post-war era were, the high levels of existential security that developed democracies experienced in the post-war decades brought an intergenerational shift from materialist values that emphasized economic and physical security above all to post-materialist values that gave priority to individual autonomy and self-expression. In 1970, I first measured these values in representative national surveys in 6 Western countries. These countries were Britain, France, West Germany, Italy, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Combined results of our survey are shown here. We asked them to choose among things that more or less everyone wants, what's the most important goals? And we found big differences between materialists who emphasized fight rising prices, maintain order, and post-materialists who emphasized freedom of speech, giving people more say in important decisions, and they were basically different emphasis. As we had expected, we hypothesized that the older generations would be predominantly materialist, and we find that's true. In the graph on the two columns on the left. These are the 65-year-olds and over, people 65 to 75 in 1970. This group was overwhelmingly materialist. There's a 14-to-1 preponderance of materialists in this black column over post-materialists who were tiny graph at the white column. But as we move from the old to the young, we find a growing number of post-materialists. The white column gets taller and taller and taller. Black column gets shorter and shorter until when we hit the post-war generation, post-materialists are actually more numerous than materialists. This, of course, could be interpreted as a life cycle effect. One reading would be that when the post-war generation gets to be 65, they'll be just as materialist as the 65-year-olds now. Then that's possible, but our reading was this was a generational difference, that the post-war generation would remain more post-materialist in their values than older generations. They would be relatively stable, and because the birth cohorts were relatively stable, as younger cohorts replaced older cohorts in the adult population, we would find the population shifting from materialist to post-materialist. We took 50 years have passed now since this first survey, and we can examine the time series evidence, and it's quite clear. The younger birth cohorts did remain more post-materialist than the older birth cohorts, which was a big shift. It was gradual but big, from a huge preponderance of materialists over post-materialists in 1972. By 1990, materialists in the whole population were about as numerous as materialists. So the two groups were equally prevalent. This value shift brought massive social and political changes as the younger groups, the post-materialists, and who tended to be younger, had very different value orientations toward stronger emphasis on environmental protection, anti-war movements, higher levels of gender equality, greater tolerance of gays, foreigners, and handicapped people, and the spread of democracy. This was what I called at the time the silent revolution. These changes came with a substantial time lag, since they moved at the pace of intergenerational population replacement. Thus, the first post-war generation, when they were 5 years old, were politically irrelevant. The 10-year-olds had little political influence, and so on. The political impact emerged when, as young adults, they were university students, 20 years after the post-war economic miracles that shaped them, producing the student protest of the 1960s and 1970s. So the cultural change comes with a timeline, but it was profound when it set in. The materialists and post-materialists had and still have profoundly different basic values. And one indication of this is rising support for environmentalist or green parties. This was strongly linked with whether an individual had materialist or post-materialist values. This graph indicates among those who gave zero post-materialist and chose zero post-materialist goals as high priority, very little, 3-4% voted for environmental parties. But as you move to the right, the vote rises up to 28% in West Germany, about 20% in Sweden, 17% in France, and so on. In Britain, with the two-party system, there was very little there. This two-party system tended to kill environmentalist parties, as is true in the United States. So there was a relatively low vote, but the underlying value polarization was very strong. This led to a change in the dominant axis of political conflict. Classically, the political polarization of left versus right was based on economic issues. The left emphasized economic redistribution, expanding the welfare state. The conservatives, the right, opposed redistribution, cut government spending. This was and still is important, but a new axis of political polarization cut across it. On one hand, we had emphasis on environmental protection, gender equality, rights for gays and immigrants, backed by a largely post-materialist audience. At the opposite pole, there was a reaction already then, weak at first, but because initially the post-materialists were a small minority, but gradually they became the dominant political influence. And this engendered increasing perception among materialists that traditional social values were being undermined. They were a less secure group and opposed immigration. And this was reflected in, over time, a growing emphasis on non-economic issues as opposed to economic issues. In 1950, the economic issues in the 50s and 60s dominated the agenda of political parties. This graph is based on the party manifestos, the issue platforms of 24 parties in Western countries. And there was a gradual shift from economic issues being dominant, still important, but they're less intense social polarization than the non-economic issues. This also was reflected in rising emphasis, a rising reaction on the part of Trump, Brexit, authoritarian populists, which our book deals with. Accordingly, social class voting fell over time. This graph shows social class voting, which is the difference between the percentage of the working class voting for the left and versus the middle class voting for the left. Thus, in 1948, Sweden had a huge social class polarization. The index was 50, meaning that the working class was 50 points more likely to vote for the left parties than the middle class. In other words, 70% working class vote, 20% middle class vote, very strong polarization. That's gone down in Sweden over time. It was high in the United States in 1948. We had a social class voting index of 45, which was unusually high for the US. But it's fallen over time. In fact, in recent elections, if you follow the line at the bottom, the US has had negative social class voting indices. This means, in other words, that the working class is somewhat more likely to vote for the right than for the left. Trump, for example, the vote for Trump was negative social class voting. The less educated, though he's a conservative, and takes a conservative position on issues across the board, but in particular the cultural issues, the less educated were more likely to vote for Trump. It's a reversal of classic patterns. So what's happened now is the surge of post-materialists was important for many years, up until about 1970s, but during the past few decades, a growing share of the publics of high-income countries have experienced declining real income and job security in context with a large flow of immigrants. This has fueled support for xenophobic populist authoritarian movements, such as British exit from the European Union, France's National Front, and Donald Trump's rise to power. The silent revolution dynamic is now moving in reverse, driven by existential insecurity among a growing share of the public. This value-based cleavage has become much stronger than the once powerful cleavages based on income, education, and social class. And one manifestation is in 2016, Donald Trump an openly racist, sexist, and xenophobic candidate, ran against a relatively liberal and cosmopolitan candidate who was also the first woman to win a major party's nomination for the presidency, Hillary Clinton. In this 2016 presidential election, the huge polarization by materialist versus post-materialist values. There was a weak economic polarization also, but largely the difference between the Trump vote and the Clinton vote can be explained by their materialist or post-materialist values. On the left, we have people who chose zero post-materialist goals in the survey as high priority. And as we move from the left to the right, we have increasing emphasis on post-materialist goals until when we get to the very right, we have a group that chose all their top choices for post-materialist goals. Among the materialist poll, 80% of the population of the people voted for Trump. Down at the opposite end, 80% voted for Trump, a huge difference. And as we move along the poll from there, the vote for Clinton in blue, as among the most materialist, only 20% voted for Clinton. As we move over to the right, it's 92% voting for Clinton. Huge polarization based on cultural values. So, but it's not this simple. It is true at the individual level. People with post-materialist values are much more likely to vote for Clinton, for example, or for whoever presumably Biden in the next election. People with materialist goals, overwhelming emphasis Trump, reflecting their basic, but this reflects their levels of underlying security experienced during their formative years. So there's a big time lag. At the individual level, the vote is dominated by individual values. But the reason why the authoritarian populist vote is much bigger now than it was 30 years ago is because of this growing economic inequality. A growing share of the population has been going nowhere. For the past 30 years, the economic gains have gone almost entirely to the top. A large share of the population has had stagnant income in an era of rising expectations. And they feel the system is failing them, and they're right. The system is failing them. I don't believe Trump is the solution, but we need to address growing economic inequality, or we're going to have continuing polarization along these lines. So this is, I'm going to leave at this point. This is a thesis that we could discuss for much longer. I wish we had the time, but it's been a pleasure to come here to address you, and I hope that someday we can do it face to face. But once again, thanks for this great honor. Best wishes to you all.